All right. Today I'm asking the question, can your Argo CD scale? Are applications syncing properly? Can you access the UI? What's your work queue depth? How many applications can you have in your Argo CD instance? Or is that even the right question? Could it be 30,000 apps? Could it be 3,000 apps? Could you run into problems with just 1,200 apps? Today we're going to talk about how to scale Argo CD. And this is a topic that has been going around and always is coming up inside of the Argo CD Slack in our GitOps Champions Discord. We always see it online. We see issues constantly talking about scaling issues, running out of API requests, taking a long time to reconcile, how many applications is reasonable, how many clusters are reasonable, all of these different dimensions. That's what we're talking about today on Argo Unpacked. And to help me do that, let me introduce my co-host, Ravital. Thanks for coming, Ravital, and for putting this together. She's the real brains behind the operation. And we also have a special guest coming on, Alexandre Gaudreau from our Haute neighbor in Canada. Thank you, Alex, for joining us. Alex is a fellow Argo maintainer and has really been, Alex, I want to say you've been an Argo maintainer for about a year. Is it more than that?
I think, I think it's been a year, but I've been using Argo for the last 5 years now. So
yeah, I was gonna say, I was like, Alex is one of our newer maintainers, and it's like, oh, I guess it's been a whole year that he's been doing it. But yeah, you've been an Argo user for a long time, and when we're gonna jump into the scale discussion pretty quickly here because you told me some things that you've seen that I was actually shocked by. You told me, you were like, oh yeah, we had an instance running 30,000 apps. And I was like, I see scaling issues with users that have 1,200 apps. So I'm excited to get into that. But before we do, we're going to talk a little bit about the latest news with Argo CD and what's happening in the community. So obviously we came out with Argo CD 3.0 2 weeks ago. And since then, we have added 2 additional point releases with bug fixes. I think overall, Alex, have you seen an uptick in issues from 3.0, or does this seem pretty par for the course with the new release?
It's pretty much same as usual. There was some, so we had breaking change, obviously, in the version 3.0, and there was some changes that we didn't anticipate it, but I think they're part of this patch release already, or they're going to be part of the next patch release. But it's nothing major. So far so good, I would say.
Yeah, we've had, so this group of fixes have all been pretty minor issues, and we always track watch very carefully issues as we go through. Obviously, as we go through a release, we have a release candidate process that takes, like a month or so, and people can deploy it and we'll find issues and we'll fix those things. But then when we go GA, a much larger pool of people will deploy it. And I think with 3.0, this is, like you said, the first release we've had in a long time where there actually are breaking changes. And so we put together a lot of documentation and guides. And a lot of the things that I was worried about people getting tripped up on, I haven't seen that problem. I've seen just kind of like the normal, little issues here and there that hasn't been too big of a deal. So
also something good with this release is if you go to the release note from 2.14 to 3.0, you actually have a lot of way to configure off. So basically, keep the old behavior, so you can still update to 3.0. But if you have some breaking change that would affect you, most of the time you can configure that so you're not affected by the breaking change, and you can take the time to, you still run 3.0, but you can take the time to adapt to the deprecated feature.
Yeah, that was a really cool thing. So some of these new defaults were considered breaking changes because they might change behavior that people expected or relied on. But since that guide does go through each of those features, and most of them you can disable, and so shouldn't be. We're not anticipating a lot of issues. And I think 2 point releases in the last 2 weeks from release, that's pretty normal. And we feel like it's getting into a pretty good state of affairs. So happy about that. Any other, we do also, for those that don't join those, we do an Argo contributor experience meeting every Thursday where we go through and talk about any contribution things that are going on. So it's a good place to track issues, and people can bring up issues that come up. But
Dan, how can people join those meetings? Where can they see the details for those?
Oh yeah, so they can go to it's on the CNCF calendar. So if you just Google like Well, we also have a link in our documentation. We have like an Argo CD. Do you have it in your head? Do you already know where it is? Because I'm like,
I know. I can drop a link in the chat.
I can drop a link as well. So you can drop a link and I'll edit to the banners.
Let's see.
Yeah, in our documentation, there's like I don't know if it's under the getting started or under support. But there's a link there. You can find the calendar link and join. So we'll throw it in the chat for people that would like to have it. Are you guys going to do it in French? Alex could.
Yeah, I can.
I can try. And so do you, Dan.
Revital, you have some French too.
Yeah, French. You speak French. We spoke French together a bit.
Yeah. Prochainement, we'll do it in French, okay?
I hope you'll invite me again.
Next time. Yeah, next time. Yeah, we'll do a special French edition.
After this episode.
Yeah. Okay. And then I think in terms of other news, housekeeping items, Revital.
No, I don't think so. I think we can jump into
next week. We're hoping.
We're hoping 2 weeks. 2 weeks.
Yeah.
From
So
today.
right now we stream to YouTube and you can watch the recordings there, but it's going to be in the next 2 weeks. You'll be able to subscribe on your podcast app. What about subscribe? Go to
codefresh.io. Oh yes. ArgoUnpacked.com.
Okay, go to ArgoUnpacked.com and subscribe. You'll get the newsletter, and that has the show notes.
Yes, and I promise you, this website will only get better and better.
Yeah, this is great. I love it. I'm already super excited about it. So,
and speaking about socials, you can always go through the LinkedIn. We have an X and Blue Sky. We're posting a lot of short videos that we're processing right after the show. If you want to see a specific topic, then go to our YouTube. And I think that's about it for now.
Perfect. We'll talk about some upcoming shows maybe at the end, but do want to jump into today's topic, which is scaling Argo CD. And Revital, you actually pitched to me bringing Alex on because of his KubeCon talk, right?
Yes. So I was there at room A, I think, and then I was responsible to do the social stuff. And I was actually amazed by Alexander. I couldn't do anything besides listening to Alexander talking about scaling Argo CD. It was super interesting to see those potential issues. And I have a lot of questions to Alexander. So we have him here.
Perfect. And we'll throw a link again in the chat to that talk for people that haven't seen it. We're not going to retread all the same ground. He did a great job of going through a lot of in-depth scenarios. We'll talk about some of them. But one of the things that we talked about, Alex, at the very start is kind of a difference in expectation. I actually had one of our users came to me and said, hey, my understanding is that I should expect Argo CD to handle about 30,000 apps before I have any problems. And I said, well, what? Why did you think that? Where did that come from? And I think, Alex, you're to blame because you told me that you actually had an instance with 30,000 apps.
I mean, it really depends what your apps are as well. You can have huge apps that have a lot of resource, and then you can use plugin, hand customize. Everything has an impact, right? And that's something that I'm trying to explain in my talk too. Like when you investigate scaling issue, you always have to find where's the bottleneck. And as soon as you fix it, the bottleneck goes elsewhere, right? The issue don't disappear. They just go to other components, and hopefully they're not as important. But yeah, I mean, you can have a lot of apps. It will depend. Do you also have a lot of clusters? Yeah.
So I wanna mention one of the comment I posted in Reddit that we're going to talk about scaling Argo CD, and then there was a comment there. I've never had Argo scaling problems ever. 3 replicas of every component is more than enough to monitor hundreds of applications and dozens of repos over several clusters. And I read that to Alexander, and he is like, hundreds.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, okay, what will happen if we have thousands of applications or even 10,000s of applications? And then I have another question. I don't want to forget that. I remember in your talk, you mentioned it was a Sunday morning and we got those alerts. And then I was wondering, how come you're getting like high CPU alert and memory consumption alert on Sunday morning and you didn't get any notifications that it's about to explode like before? Don't we have alerts that can tell us, hey, be careful, you're about to get to, high CPU usage and stuff like that?
That's something that we currently don't have actually in the open source repo. So we have some metrics, some open source graph on a dashboard that it's not that up to date. I think that's some focus. That's something we need to improve on. A lot of people are using Argo, and a lot of people are
Definitely.
monitoring it, having alerts on different metrics, but it's not an easy place to contribute back to the project because we kind of haven't built basically the framework or the baselines that people can just, I'll drop my new alert, Grafana alert or my new alerting rule
Mm-hmm.
just in some folder, right? So I think we need to get together to like build that structure for the alerting recommendation or even have default alerts.
It would
to
probably be
help
good
them.
just for documentation because it's like people are using Datadog or they're using whatever other system. And so having it be inside of Argo CD may not be the
Yeah,
most easy, but having at least a guide to say like, hey, these are things you should look out for. So that
and
yeah.
you can
So we're
track.
saying that we do not have those recommendations yet, right?
It's not there. There are some, but I think there's a lot of improvement we can do. And I know at Intuit this year we're going to look at improving that internally, and I think most of it will go back as well into the open source repo.
Yeah, there is a page on monitoring, but it doesn't talk about at all what metrics you should be like wary of as an issue. So that's a good issue for us to take. And then the other location, and I'll throw this one in the chat too, that is, I think, probably the best guide within the documentation is actually on high availability. And that's where it goes through and talks about, okay, here's how you can scale each of these components. Here's the number of settings you should be aware of. I do have it linked from our blog post. If you just search like scaling Argo CD securely, you'll find a CodeFresh blog post, and I linked to it from there, along with some other like security considerations and things you might want to check out. But yeah, we'll throw that in the chat. This difference of scale that we're coming to it is all about configuration and setup and what's going on. And I think we've seen a pretty good diversity of installation. So Alexander, you brought up a single instance with 30,000. I actually haven't seen that in the wild before. So that one was unusual to me. I have seen companies across multiple instances that have upwards of 1 million applications, and the kinds of challenges they have, related to, and this goes back to like the Chef Puppet days of like, oh, I trigger a release and there's 1 million apps that need to get updated. I'm actually DDoSing my Git server.
Yeah.
And so that's a different scale challenge than you're going to have at even a couple hundred applications. But within this, I think that there's kind of a sense of invincibility some admins have, like that person on Reddit, who are like, oh, I've never had any scaling issues ever. What are you talking about? I'm never going to run into anything. And it's like, well, you might.
Yeah. I do think that Argo as well is built in a way that it's gonna scale, and if you just throw more resource at it, it's gonna work well. And that's actually some feedback I had after the talk in London. People didn't know that. People thought Argo needed 4 CPU. Like, that's normal. That's just the way it is. And people thought a high amount of reconcile is just normal. So some people just understood, okay, well, actually, it's not normal that Argo does that many reconcile. It's not normal that Argo use that much CPU. So the fact to know that, oh, we can actually improve these things will help Argo basically scale more instead of just throwing more resource at it. Yeah.
Yeah, that was one of my big takeaways from your talk, was that people are accepting a level of resource usage that they probably don't have to. And that usually starts with saying, okay, first of all, oh man, there's so many different ways you can take it, right? But like in your case, it was looking at you actually were changing the reconciliation times, leveraging webhooks, but then you had spikes that started to hit, where it was, what had happened, I think, was that you had the optimization you had done had triggered a cache expiration miss in repo server. So now it needed a refetch, right?
It's also, I kind of made a bunch of different problems that we've experienced over time, kind of made a story with it. But that's always what happens, right? You fix one setting, you improve one thing, and then the pressure points are moved to another components. And just last, it happened last month at Intuit, where we configure some optimization, and then the communication with the Kubernetes API were throwing timeouts after that. So now we have to investigate that other part, and it takes time. Especially like if you don't know what to monitor, it takes a lot of time. So that's why I think improving that documentation, like we have good logs in Argo. If you look at there's one log, I think it's reconciliation completed. And on that, you have all the different millisecond time for the different part of the reconcile and sync process. So if you use Splunk or Datadog, I guess you can craft a query to like have a list of the top 50 application that take the most time to reconcile, and then you can start investigating that, and you can build some alerts on what's not acceptable as a reconciliation time for your company. Like usually Argo should be fast. If you click refresh and it takes 30 seconds, it's pretty slow. I mean, why does it take 30 seconds? There's probably a good reason behind it.
Yeah, that level of optimization is something I found most companies actually don't do, because they're just like, because Argo CD will work well enough that they're not going to go peek under the hood. But when you have a tool that is, this is the way that our developers can deploy things, this is the way that we can fix issues when they happen, this is critical infrastructure. In fact, it might be the most critical component of your infrastructure, maybe just behind like the Kubernetes cluster itself, because if you can't get the changes out.
But even one step before, does it even make sense to create like a set of rules? For instance, how many apps should a single Argo CD controller manage, right? If it manages more than thousands, because this guy had hundreds and everything just worked well.
When you say controller, you mean like an Argo CD instance?
Yes.
Okay.
I would say,
does it make sense to have set of rules, or it's really up to the logic of these applications or resources that we're using?
I would say it's not really the number of resource. It's really monitoring different other metrics. I mean, I'm always talking about the reconciliation, but it can be, the time to fetch a Git repo. It can be the time to run the, let's say, customized rendering or M rendering. So there's a lot of different things you can monitor. you can also monitor the whole journey based on those logs, like how much time did it take to sync or to reconcile an app. And then based on if those metrics, if they're all fine, and people keep onboarding and creating more and more app on your instance, you don't have any issue. But if these metrics starts to take more and more time, and you see a slight increase over time as people onboard on Argo, then you need to address the situation. You need to ask, like, oh, why is my baseline always increasing?
You also mentioned bottlenecks, and you talked about work queues, whether the work queues are full or not. You mentioned the reconciliation queue, the operation queue, and I'm wondering, don't we need to have like alerts on those queues, the size of the queues? Isn't it basic to have?
Yeah, I think those are absolutely needed. And it really, I think as an open source project, we can decide, well, let's just give the default configuration based on Alert Manager because it's another CNCF project. We also have like a graph and a dashboard, and in our demo instance, so cd.apps.argoproj.io, we have, I think, Prometheus deployed there. So we could have example alerts on the best practice as part of the open source project. But those are two things, yeah, you need to monitor. And just last Friday at Intuit, we rolled out a new version. And in one of our instances, the reconciliation rate tripled just after the update. And
this was moved to 3.0?
No, it was actually a bump to 2.14.
Okay.
Yeah. And what happened is that instance had a lot of very old, unknown applications where the cluster don't exist anymore and that haven't been cleaned up. And these applications started to reconcile in loop like for forever. So the reconciliation rate went super high, the CPU went super high. So if you don't have alerts on that, you're just going to roll that version. And if you're not looking at that graph at the exact moment you deploy, you're going to miss it. And if you look at it one day after, you're going to think, oh, my reconciliation was always that high. Like, that's normal. That's my baseline. But so that's why you need alerting. You need to detect the anomalies when you release a new version, or over time as people add more applications, especially if you're, as a platform team or as the Argo operator, if you're not responsible of what people do with their application. So if you just manage Argo CD, but you leave the responsibility to the developer to decide if they do Elm-based application, customized-based application, multi-source, then you expose yourself to a lot more issue because people can create a lot more applications with different usage footprints.
Well, that's something that I have actually used as an example, Alex, when I'm talking to users where they're like, I've actually had people tell me, they say, oh, we know that this should work because Intuit does it. And I always will say, what does Intuit do? And then they'll describe to me back what they think that you do. And one of the things that a lot of people don't know is that Intuit pre-renders all manifests.
Yeah.
So if Argo CD isn't rendering a Helm chart, it's not rendering a customized, it's not having to go and fetch a bunch of remote bases. It's literally just looking at a repository with pre-rendered manifests. It's going to do less work. Now, that's not a decision that, as far as I've talked to Michael and some of the other Intuit folks about this over the years, the decision was not made to use pre-rendered manifests for any optimization of Argo CD. It was only done because there was a desire to have like easier diffing from an end user perspective, but it does have a huge impact on scale. That, it's not necessarily the reason that you did it, but it is a benefit that you get.
Yeah.
So here's Here's another best practice or like rule of thumb. When should teams start pre-rendering a manifest? When should they start doing that? From day one, or
I mean, I think you should wait a bit and start to use Argo Hydrator in a very few months. I mean, even now, Argo Hydrators work, and it can do the hydration for you, commit back to Git, and you can sync exactly what the hydration committed to Git. So
I don't know. I don't know that I would necessarily recommend to people that they need to start doing pre-rendered manifest.
pre-rendering?
Like,
yeah.
I think there are benefits to it, and if you're looking for those benefits, then it makes sense. But if like those aren't things that you care about, then going through the extra work is maybe not worth it. But
it does help to enable that promotion process when you have rendered manifest. So I think it's a prerequisite to have that kind of promotion process, especially if you want the auto sync enabled. Otherwise, you don't really know what you're gonna deploy. It can be a bit more risky, but
well, actually, Alex, I'm gonna push back on you again too, because from a promotion perspective, that use case is specific. So in the case of Intuit, I know that you guys do a lot of you pre-render manifests, and those manifests get copied wholesale from one environment to another environment as you do a push out. Now it's not across the board, but there's a bunch that are like that. And so that makes perfect sense for that use case. But we see a lot of people who are doing promotions where they're only changing a specific value and that there's differences between environments. And so in those cases, pre-rendering could be part of the process, but it doesn't have to be.
We actually don't do the manifests are different. We do render each environment individually. So we don't promote like
you don't do a wholesale promotion between, because that's what GitOps Promoter is designed for.
No, GitOps Promoter will basically it renders each environment individually, and the promotion concept is about taking something in a stage branch, so in a temporary branch, and moving that to the branch that Argo syncs. So if you think about it with the hydrator hydrates to branch B, and Argo, the same application, syncs branch A. So the promotion
promoter pushes from B to A.
Yeah, exactly.
But with no differences, with no differences between B and A.
Yeah, there's no application syncing the B branch. It's just temporary. It's hydrated, but it's not yet deployed.
Yeah, and I know there's benefits to that. So I'm not doing it. I think it's great. I think the render manifest pattern is great, and it has a lot of advantages. But to really tell your point of like, oh, when should people do that? It's like, nah, I guess when you need to.
Yeah.
Like, I wouldn't say you have to like do it beforehand necessarily.
Yeah, it's all about trade-off, and actually, the companies are different size. You cannot automate everything from start. Sometimes, if you have a smaller company, just doing it quickly in the Jenkins pipeline or in your CI pipeline will be enough. Some people will just go with autosync from the start and just assume the risk of syncing something that will break and then fix it, try to fix it or roll it back as fast as they can.
But you're saying that you don't actually have any manifests that are the same between environments?
No, I mean, in general, every application, every environment will need different configs, so different CPU requests, because your dev and staging have different footprints, or just some environment variable configuration to reach different endpoint between production and staging will always be different. So I think it's a very common pattern to take like a fully hydrated manifest, because it contains environment specific configuration most of the time. So you cannot really move that.
Okay. So I misunderstood a conversation I had with Michael, because I actually thought it was like that, and I was like, man, that's like pretty specific. Like most people can't do it that way.
Yeah, no.
But I'm glad you cleared that up for us. Okay. So another
back to
go
scaling.
ahead.
Yeah, back to scaling this system too. It's alpha. So as people starts to use it, we're gonna discover scaling issue on this. So we need to monitor it as well thoroughly as we roll it out into it.
Yeah. So there's actually another thing on scale that I wanted to bring, which is your talk was really focused on like, hey, here are these different areas, and here's how to approach the optimization process. And one of the questions that I set out to answer a few years ago was, when should you start thinking about tuning? Like what's the number? And I came up with a conservative estimate of like, if you're using Argo CD, you should probably expect not to really have to touch any knobs before 1,500 apps. But even that's a little bit variable. And so I actually put in, it was like either 1,500 apps or 14,000 objects or 50 clusters or 200 developers.
When you say objects, do you mean resources?
An object within a Kubernetes, within an Argo CD application, there's a bunch of objects, and it's like a deployment, a pod, a service, a config map, because you could have a single app with, 20,000 objects on it, and you're going to get a different performance bottleneck than if you have 1,500 apps with one object each, right?
What about number of resources? Because I remember that Alexander also talked about the ignore resource updates.
Yeah, and sometimes, you're just, if you're a big company and you roll out Argo in that big company, and you just maybe deploy one namespace with Argo and the cluster is huge, then just the fact you have a big cluster integrated in Argo can have a serious impact, even if Argo does not care about 95% of all the resource in the cluster. So yeah, I think.
So my question is, what do you mean Argo doesn't care about 95% of those resources? What does it mean, unnecessary resources?
Yeah, so let's say in Argo you deploy a very simple app. There's a deployment, a service, an ingress, and some pods. What Argo cares about is these object kind and all the kind related to these objects. So for instance, if you have a deployment, you're going to care about the replica set because you want to see deployment, replica set, and pod in the UI. So you want to see these resources in the UI, or these resources are part of your desired manifest that is committed in your Git repo. So when I say like, oh, Argo care about these resources, that's those specific object kind that I refer. And also in the namespace it deploys to. So if Argo only deploy to one specific namespace in one cluster, then you just want to monitor objects of that namespace in Argo. You don't want Argo to have access to all other cluster where it's never going to deploy a resource in. So
it'll go and check those things to see if there's resources it's supposed to be looking for. So it's a bunch of useless API calls.
Yeah. So it's not like I would say you don't need to fine tune Argo initially, but I like to think about fine tuning it as you deploy it, as you roll it out, whenever you integrate a new cluster in Argo, you have to think about the impact of adding this cluster and what's going to be, what the usage is going to be, and what's the best way you can add it. If it's just you're adding a cluster to deploy to a few namespace, then you can configure it from the start. If you know it's a cluster where you're going to deploy in every namespaces, then you're gonna give it permission on all namespace. It's a bit the same approach I go with security. Basically, when you integrate a new thing, you think about the access from the start. Which access am I going to give to this cluster? How it's going to be used?
Yeah.
So you're already asking those questions for the security. So you can also ask these questions for performance at the same time.
That's another example where people get a performance benefit from something that they did for a totally different reason, like security. But they didn't realize they were also getting the performance benefit. And they'll be like, oh, we didn't even do any optimization. We had this. And it's like, kind of.
It's
you
just
did the optimization. You just didn't know it.
Yeah, you did configure it correctly initially. Yeah.
That was something else that you brought up in your talk that was a surprise to me, was actually how resource intensive orphan resource monitoring is.
Yeah, I didn't have enough time to really talk about it thoroughly, but it's been, yeah, I think the feature of orphan resource is very specific to one usage pattern. So basically, if you use orphan resource, you're basically using Argo to monitor Kubernetes resources that are unrelated to Argo. So that means Argo needs to know about everything. So it works well if really you monitor a namespace and there's only Argo resource, and maybe once in a while there's going to be a resource that's not part of Argo, and this resource is going to show up as orphan in your application. But if you try to monitor orphan resource and it is expected to have orphan resource, then that feature is gonna cost a lot of resources. I don't think that's the right usage for it. Like,
Yeah.
Argo is not a tool to monitor your Kubernetes cluster. Argo is a tool to monitor your application from the developer point of view.
Yeah, within Kubernetes manifests, there is a field that I think is resource version. Is that the one that gets updated all the time?
Yeah.
So like anytime there's an update to that object, anytime there's an event, the resource version will get updated. And so it's changing all the time because there's Kubernetes events happening, there's CPU pressure, whatever, because there's log messages, and then those roll up too. So like if you have an alert on a pod or something, and it could just be pod is ready or whatever, that updates the pod, but that then triggers an update to the replica set, and then triggers an update to the deployment. So all of those get a new resource version. And so you can see in Kubernetes where you just go and pull the same resource and just look at the resource version and see how often it changes. Yeah. And so if it's like you have orphaned objects, all these random orphaned objects, it's just doing a bunch of extra work for no reason. Now, I actually will sometimes tell people, like when they're migrating to Argo CD, like turn that on to see how much stuff you don't have as part of Argo CD applications. But I wouldn't have thought necessarily to say like, by the way, make sure you turn it off, because it's going to take up a bunch of resources for no reason.
Yeah, I mean, if there are nothing that does not belong to Argo CD, that's fine. But when, let's say, you deploy an app in Kube system, and that's one thing I did in the past. I had orphan resource monitoring enabled, and I was deploying, I think it was Prometheus, and then some resource needed to be in Kube system. So whenever something in the Kube system namespace changed, that Prometheus app was reconciled. So everything changes all the time in Kube system. There's a lot of resource there. There's the control plane is there. So like you had just the Prometheus app constantly being reconciled. And that's why I'm saying you should monitor like the rate at which an application is reconciled. Go use the Argo CD log to look at the top 50 most reconciled applications, and just investigate why is it reconciled that often. Every time you're gonna figure out like you're gonna realize that it doesn't need to. It doesn't.
And this is well, on the orphan resource, is it more intensive to monitor an orphaned resource than if that resource is part of an application?
What happens is if the resource change in a namespace, the resource is orphaned, it doesn't belong to any application. So Argo will reconcile all the applications that have the permission, I think, to deploy in that namespace.
So there's two ways to solve this. One is don't monitor orphan resources, and the other is make sure they're all part of applications. And if they're all part of applications, then they will be handled separately. It's because there's an unknown question of, does this resource, is it supposed to have some kind of impact on these applications? I better go double check.
Yeah, and the configuration to monitor the orphan resource, it's not on the application, it's on the app project. So if let's say you have one app project and you have 50 applications part of this app project, I think all the applications part of this app project will be reconciled.
Wow.
I'm not sure about the algorithm anymore. I think I added in my slide the flow, but it's the mechanism to try to figure out which app do I need to actually update because of a orphan resource change is it cannot be efficient, basically.
Yeah, it almost I guess I would say just to always leave off the orphan resource monitoring, because it becomes dangerous. Yeah. That like you might have a resource added that you didn't want. That might be another area of improvement for Argo CD of helping you track down these road resources in a less cost CPU intensive way.
Yeah, and perhaps it's something that shouldn't be part of Argo main feature. It could be another controller, because we know the resources that are managed by Argo by looking at the tracking label, tracking annotations. So if we can look at all the resources in the cluster, find which resource do not have the tracking annotation or do not have a owner reference that leads back to a resource with a tracking annotation, and you can list all the resources that are not managed by Argo in your cluster. But then I think who will look at these, right? Is it the developer responsibility? Is it the Kubernetes platform team that should look at those? Maybe it depends on the namespace. So maybe you want to build some alerting based on who are the namespace owner, and if there's a resource in the namespace that's not part of Argo, you send them an alert.
Yeah, we usually try to get people into the pattern of, you bootstrap your Kubernetes cluster. The first thing you do is install Argo and have some, Git source that you're pointing at for it to start bootstrapping application sets or whatever else. And that the only interface you ever make changes on is in Git. And so it's only what Argo is syncing. So you would avoid ever having any resources deployed that weren't part of an Argo CD application. Do you have any pushback on that advice?
I think that's good to have, if developer don't have Kubernetes access, or they don't have any other way to deploy things in the cluster than Argo CD, what's the need to monitor
why do you even need orphan monitoring?
Yeah.
And I would like to ask, when you say we advise, where can people like me find those advices? Is it documented somewhere?
You mean like from the CodeFresh perspective? Like what I was saying? A lot of it general. Yeah, some of it is in the GitOps training certification. So if you do that, I don't know.
But that's my problem.
Yeah.
Because you said some of it. I'm like, maybe it's a new project that I will take and start working on it. It's super interesting to me. Scaling is hard, and those advices are super duper important.
Yeah.
And
No,
if they are,
we should. No, we actually talked about this last week because we had so we do like for our users, they'll like pull us in for a consult. They'll be like, hey, we're seeing this behavior, and we'll go in and investigate it and help them fix it. And so a lot of those things happen in these one-on-one conversations where people are like dealing with a specific issue. But we did actually take a little while ago, people were saying, well, we would like to have a guide for scaling both Argo CD as well as like the control plane that CodeFresh offers, CodeFresh GitOps, of like, what are the breakpoints, when you're going to hit those, what are the things to do. And it is a daunting project because of the number of different kinds of scenarios that people can run into. So like a good example is we have documentation on timeout reconciliation jitter and like why that's useful. But there's probably 1,000 different scenarios where that would become useful. So doing it from a scenario perspective then would be tricky to like document those.
And that's
it's funny. It's funny that you mentioned the jitter. That was my actually next question, because Alexander mentioned that spikes cause problems, and then he mentioned that jitter.
And I'll lead back to the beginning of this this podcast. We talked about 3.0, and one thing we did in 3.0 is configure a bunch of new settings that improve either security and scalability, and jitter is one of them. Because really you don't want spike by default. So now instead of having a 3 minutes reconciliation timeout by default, I think it's a 2-minute timeout plus 1 minute jitter. So in the end, it's still a 3-minute maximum reconciliation time, but now it's a bit more efficient by default.
Yeah, so the new default is 1 minute, you said it was?
Yeah, I think the jitter is 1 minute, or maybe it's 2 minute 30 and 30 seconds jitter. But now we have a jitter that's not 0 anymore.
Yeah, you know what? We have to update the documentation on the high availability page because it says that the default is 0. So now we have to update it to say it's now 1 minute.
So open an issue then. I'll fix it.
I'll throw it in the chat. But yeah, we should to talk about that jitter for just a second, because this was another one of your findings, was that as you did some improvement, you then created these spikes where things were suddenly hitting reconciliation all at the same time. So you introduced jitter, which spread out the requests. Is that I actually haven't looked at that function before with jitter. Does it do a randomize on time for every application?
So what actually, it was super easy to implement, because in Kubernetes, in the libraries, we have the work queues, and we can just use add after feature, and that's all handled by the work queue. So we just add a random number of time at the end, instead of adding the item to the queue immediately. So we add the item to the queue, generate a random number that's going to be your jitter, and use that value to add it in the queue. And the Kubernetes work queue on the controller will take care of basically
the schedule,
reconciling that app at the right moment.
Yeah, and I'm glad we introduced that. I was watching your talk. I was like, wait, why don't we have jitter as like a default value that's turned on? And I didn't even realize that was something that was added in 3.0. So that's nice.
Amazing. Anything else? Any other topics, Dan, you would like to talk about?
There's one more before we close. So we talked about this need to monitor kind of key metrics. And one that has come up for me recently with several users has been Git API calls. And we actually, this might surprise people here, we actually don't track it outside of Argo CD. We don't have like a metric that shows Git API calls. And we also don't have in our logging a You can't look at it by like Git provider, right? So you might have multiple Git providers. But we also don't have a logging mechanism that says these are the things that are causing the request to Git. So if you're trying to track that down and trying to figure out what it is, you have to infer it from a bunch of other logs. So that is a task that we took and are working on right now, is adding better logging around Git and metrics around Git, because it is every bit a key resource in your Argo CD setup as anything else is. And if you're not monitoring it as you're scaling and you're like, oh, I'm using all these great application sets, it's awesome, we're rocking and rolling. Hang on, Argo CD can't see Git anymore. What's going on? I'm now hitting all these failures, and it's because the Git API is blocking us because we're using too many API requests.
Yeah. You have it on the repo server and also the application set. The generators can be very can consume a lot of resources.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I actually had a user with less than 1,000 apps that was hitting their Git API limits. And it turned out there was some misconfiguration. They had like an application set that was actually combining 2 different Git generators needlessly. Yeah. And so we could eliminate that. But then it was like, oh, okay, actually we should be using webhooks. And they were like, oh, we are using webhooks. And it's like, but not on application sets, which use a whole different webhook system. So we had to do that. But Git as like a key metric, this is something that we're going to be doing some more content around and talking about this. And there's another limiter related to that, which is GitHub doesn't have distributed Git support, but GitLab does. So if you have GitLab, you can actually point at a Git repo that has mirrors all over the world, and it has a little redirect set up, and Argo CD doesn't obey it. You can't use the redirect. So Git is a key that you need to scale, and there is a system of scaling Git, but also we don't support it. so that's that was another issue that came up in the last like month or two, that was like, oh yeah, shoot, like people are hitting this scale here on the Git API requests, and there actually is a great solution for handling it, but we actually just don't allow for the redirect. And we don't for security reasons was the answer to that. But that is something that we were going through in issues, and I think it's something that's going to get resolved in this next probably like 3.1 release, is starting to obey those API redirects.
Did we have?
Okay, I will.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Alexander. Go ahead.
Did we have question from the chat on scaling?
Oh yeah, we did tell people bring your questions, and mostly the questions are about our French and how good our French is, and are we going to be speaking French now? When will the French happen?
And bonjour.
Yeah, but feel free to add those questions into the chat. We're monitoring those on LinkedIn, on X, on YouTube, and we'll try to do those. And then while those questions are coming in, Rovital, do you want to tell us what upcoming episodes are going to talk about?
Yes. So we are going to talk about, give me 1 second to just open my calendar here. We will have Jan Fischer.
Another Argo CD maintainer, a rock star Argo CD maintainer.
Yes. And as a preparation, you can watch his talk on ArgoCon that was there in London. We will be talking about redefining the multi-cluster story.
Yes.
You were that?
Yeah, because he's been implementing a agent that allows you to distribute the load of Argo CD across multiple clusters. So that has some cool security and performance implications.
Yep. And of course, you can subscribe here to get our newsletter, and go to our YouTube to watch our videos. Find us on social through Argo Unpacked.
And then after that, we've got Adobe coming on. Mike Tugeron, who's has been a great speaker at ArgoCon several times. He and I have given some talks together. He's a good buddy of mine, and we'll talk about some of the ways that Adobe is using Argo CD, because they have a pretty interesting use case. Let's put it that way. So
Oh,
definitely
yeah.
don't want to miss that
I
one.
did chat with Mike about some issues as well.
Scaling issues for
based
sure.
on what they're using. Yeah, they're using it at scale. We can say that.
Yeah, they're using it as scale. Yeah, I like a really, really good scale. So I think we've done a good job of covering the topic of scaling Argo CD. Some of the things you're going to run into, we did get some resources in here so that if you're working on this at in your company or at your home or whatever, you have some areas to go into. If you have those questions, feel free to always ping us on Argo Unpacked. If you're in the Discord, jump in the Discord and drop your questions there, the GitOps Champions Discord. If you don't have an invite to the Discord, you get one when you sign up for the GitOps training and certification. Go to learning.codefresh.io and you can get your GitOps training and certification. And it covers actually a lot of the best practices that we've talked about today in terms of how you set up your Argo instance, how you set up your applications, how application sets work, the different components of scale that you're going to want to have there, that reliability. And I take actually, Alex, one of my biggest takeaways from you in the talk that you gave was just the importance of setting up that monitoring early, because you don't want to be reactive to critical infrastructure problems. You want to be proactive to those problems.
And definitely not on Sunday morning.
Definitely not on Sunday morning.
And also, to the people listening, if you have alerting already configured in Argo, and if you have some nice log query to monitor Argo, feel free to open an issue, drop those just as an example to share, and maybe that will be helpful to try to turn this into like a more concise documentation on how to monitor Argo.
Yeah, it wouldn't be an open source project if there wasn't homework for everybody to do at
home. That's correct. Okay, Alexander, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Yeah,
that was great. Thank you so much.
That was great.
Yeah, great topic. Okay, well, we'll catch all you Argonauts on the next one. Stay synced.
Thank you.